This 4-year-old beggar girl is thrown into a sewer puddle, but a millionaire saw it and did something that shocked everyone. Watch until the end. You won't regret it. Comment on what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The scream echoed through the dusty streets of Harmony Creek like a gunshot, shattering the quiet of the Georgia afternoon. Richard Sterling, 52, nearly dropped his cell phone when he saw the scene through the windshield of his black Cadillac. There, on the corner of Main Street, 5 teenagers surrounded a small girl, their cruel laughter mixing with the child's desperate sobs. "Go on, you little stink! Get the quarter in there!" one of the boys yelled, brutally shoving the girl towards a puddle of dirty water that had accumulated near the clogged drain. Lily, just 4 years old, tried to balance on her thin legs, but the push was too strong. She fell to her knees in the foul water, her ragged clothes soaking up the dark liquid that smelled of sewage and garbage. Her brown hair stuck to her dirty face, and her hazel eyes filled with tears that mixed with the grime. Richard killed the engine and got out of the car without thinking. The businessman, known throughout the county for his cold-blooded business dealings and for never showing emotions, felt something strange burning in his chest. It was as if something dormant for decades had suddenly awakened. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, approaching quickly. The teenagers looked at the man in the grey suit and Italian shoes, immediately recognizing his importance. Without a word, they ran off through the narrow alleyways of downtown Harmony Creek, leaving only their laughter echoing in the hot air. Lily remained crouched in the puddle, trembling like a leaf in the wind. When Richard approached and reached out to help her, she recoiled violently, her big eyes fixed on him with pure terror. "Easy, little one. I'm not going to hurt you," Richard said, crouching down slowly to be at her level. But Lily couldn't hear his words clearly. The infection she'd contracted months ago, when she was sleeping rough during the rain, had partially damaged her hearing. She saw the man's lips moving, but the sounds reached her ears, muffled and confused. The girl tried to stand up, but her legs were trembling so much that she almost fell again. Her small hands were cut by the shards of glass scattered on the sidewalk, and blood mixed with the dirty water on her skinny arms. "Please let me help you," Richard insisted, but Lily shook her head desperately and ran off, disappearing between the parked cars. Richard stood there, his hands still outstretched in the air, feeling completely lost. There was something in those terrified eyes that disturbed him deeply. It wasn't just ordinary fear, it was the dread of someone who had suffered too much at the hands of adults. He looked around, looking for someone who could give him information about the girl, but the few people on the street looked away and hurried on. Everyone knew Lily, the beggar girl who had been living on the streets for 2 years, but nobody wanted to get involved. Across the square, hidden behind his colorful ice cream cart, Benny Sanders, 67, watched the whole scene with a heavy heart. The old vendor had seen a lot in his life, but nothing hurt him as much as seeing Lily being mistreated. Benny knew every corner of those streets, every child who played in the parks, every family who struggled to survive. But Lily was special to him. There was something about that girl that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, or how her eyes sparkled when he gave her a free ice cream. What Benny didn't reveal to anyone was that there was a very specific reason for his affection for Lily, a reason he had kept as his biggest secret for over 2 years. Richard got back in the car, but couldn't start the engine immediately. His hands were shaking slightly, something that hadn't happened since he lost his parents in an accident when he was 17. At that time, he had sworn to himself that he would never again let feelings interfere with his life. But now, at 52, owner of one of the largest construction companies in Georgia, married to Margaret for 15 years, he felt like a lost boy in the face of those hazel eyes full of pain. During the drive home, Richard couldn't get Lily out of his thoughts. Where did she sleep? What did she eat? Who took care of her when she was sick? The questions hammered in his mind, creating a discomfort he didn't know how to deal with. Upon arriving at his mansion in the upscale neighborhood of River Oaks, he found Margaret arranging flowers in the garden. His wife, 48, was an elegant and controlling woman, known for commanding family decisions with surgical precision. She looked up when she saw him get out of the car. "You're late," she said, without taking her eyes off the red roses she was pruning with excessive care. "Dr. Evans called. The test results are in." Richard felt his stomach tighten. For 15 years they had been trying to have children, going through every possible treatment, facing constant hopes and frustrations. Margaret had become obsessed with motherhood, turning each menstrual cycle into a personal tragedy. "So?" he asked, approaching. "Negative. Again," Margaret replied, her voice laden with a bitterness that grew with each month. 15 years, Richard. 15 years trying to have a child of our own." Richard hugged her, but his mind was still with Lily. For a terrible moment, he wondered why fate denied children to those who could raise them with love and security, while letting an innocent child suffer on the streets, abandoned by those who should protect her. That night, Lily slept huddled under the awning of the old Woolworth store, using a piece of cardboard as a mattress. Her arms ached from the falls of the day, and her stomach rumbled with hunger. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the face of her mother, Delilah, but the memories were becoming increasingly blurred. 2 blocks away, Richard lay beside Margaret, but sleep didn't come. He kept wondering if the girl was warm enough, if she had eaten something, if someone took care of her when she had nightmares. What he didn't know was that his life was about to transform completely, and that casual encounter on the street would be just the first of many that would reveal secrets capable of shaking all the certainties he had built over the years. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard completely changed his routine. Every day during lunch, he drove through the streets of downtown Harmony Creek looking for Lily. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him to those places he had previously avoided, the dusty streets where the working-class commerce bubbled and where poverty showed itself undisguised. Margaret began to notice her husband's absences. In the 15 years of marriage, Richard had always been meticulous with schedules, especially meal times. Now he came home late, distracted, fidgeting nervously with his cell phone, as if he were expecting an important call. "Where have you been having lunch?" she asked one Thursday, when he arrived at 3 in the afternoon with his clothes slightly crumpled. "Work meetings," Richard replied, avoiding his wife's penetrating gaze. "New contracts in the metro area." But Margaret knew her husband too well. There was something different about him, a restlessness that she couldn't decipher. And when Margaret couldn't control a situation, she became dangerously determined to find out the truth. Meanwhile, Lily had developed her own routine for survival. She woke up before sunrise and walked to Joe's bakery, where she sometimes got some breadcrumbs left over from the previous day. Then she positioned herself in front of the First Baptist Church, holding out her small hand to the parishioners leaving the 7 o'clock Mass. It was on one of those mornings that Richard finally found her again. She was sitting on the steps of the church, humming softly to a song he didn't recognize. Her hair was dirtier than last time, and a fresh wound gleamed on her left knee. This time, Richard approached more slowly, stopping a few feet away. He took from his pocket a bag with sweet rolls he had bought at the most expensive bakery in town. "Lily," he said softly, placing the bag on the ground between them. The girl looked up, recognizing him immediately. Fear returned to dominate her little face, but this time she didn't run away. Hunger was stronger than terror. "You can take it," Richard said, taking a few steps back. "It's yours." Lily looked at the bag, then at him, then back at the bag. Slowly, she stretched out her arm and took the bread, but her eyes remained fixed on Richard, like a wounded animal waiting for the next blow. "What's your real name?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Lily chewed the sweet roll voraciously, as if she hadn't eaten in days. When he repeated the question, she pointed to herself and said in a hoarse and low voice, "Lily." The way she pronounced her own name broke Richard's heart. There was an ancient sadness in that small voice, a resignation that no 4-year-old should carry. From that day on, Richard established a routine. Every day at 11 in the morning, he passed by the church and left food for Lily. First were breads, then fruits, and eventually complete meals that he bought in nearby restaurants. Lily began to wait for him. First, hidden behind the pillars of the church, watching him from afar. Then, sitting on the steps, still suspicious, but willing to accept the food. Gradually, the fear in her eyes was replaced by a cautious curiosity. It was during the 3rd week that Benny decided to approach Richard. The old ice cream vendor had observed all the interactions between the businessman and the girl, and something in his chest said that this man had no bad intentions. "Good morning, sir," Benny said, pushing his colorful cart towards Richard. "I've seen you taking care of little Lily." Richard turned around, surprised. It was the first time someone had addressed him about the girl without showing judgment or suspicion. "You know her?" Richard asked. "Yes, I do. She's been living on the streets for 2 years since her mother disappeared," Benny explained, choosing his words carefully. "She's a good girl, just very hurt inside." "And no one has ever tried to help her? Any relatives? Any institutions?" Benny lowered his eyes. "The streets of Harmony Creek are full of children like her, sir. And her mother, well, Delilah wasn't very reliable, if you know what I mean." The mother's name echoed in Richard's mind like a distant bell. Delilah. There was something familiar about that name, but he couldn't place the memory. "Does she have a hearing problem?" Richard asked. "Sometimes it seems like she doesn't hear what I say." "She had an ear infection last winter. It wasn't treated properly," Benny replied, the sadness evident in his voice. "Since then, she hasn't heard well." That afternoon, Richard went home with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He went into the office and started researching hearing impairment in children, available treatments, specialists in the area. For the first time in months, he had a clear goal that didn't involve contracts or profits. Margaret watched her husband from the office door, noticing how he typed furiously on the computer, completely absorbed. When she approached to see what he was researching, Richard quickly closed the screen. "Research for a new project," he said, avoiding her gaze. But Margaret had seen the words childhood hearing test on the screen before he closed it. Her heart began to beat faster. Why would her husband be researching hearing in children? They didn't have children. They didn't have small nephews or nieces. What was going on? That night, after Richard fell asleep, Margaret took his cell phone and began to check his recent calls. She found several calls to ear, nose and throat clinics, medical offices specializing in children, and even to a hearing rehabilitation center in Atlanta. Margaret's blood ran cold. After 15 years of trying to have a child, after all the treatments, all the frustrated hopes, had Richard found a child somewhere else? Did he have a secret child she didn't know about? Suspicion grew like a weed in her chest. Margaret had always known she was a controlling woman, but she had never felt such a cold and calculating fury as the one that took over her at that moment. The next morning, she hired the most expensive private detective in Harmony Creek. Meanwhile, Lily had begun to trust Richard more. When he arrived at the church, she no longer hid. Sometimes she even smiled shyly when he appeared with his bag of food. Her hazel eyes sparkled with a light that didn't exist before. Benny watched this approach with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, he was happy to see Lily receiving care. On the other hand, he carried a secret that ached in his chest, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Every night, when he closed his ice cream cart and returned to his simple house on the outskirts of town, Benny looked at a faded photo he kept in the drawer of the dresser. It was a photo of an 18-year-old girl with the same hazel eyes as Lily, holding a newborn baby. Delilah, his daughter, who had run away from home 28 years ago after a violent argument about her early pregnancy. Benny had never seen his daughter or granddaughter again, but for all these years, he had searched for them tirelessly. When Lily appeared on the streets of Harmony Creek 2 years ago, Benny knew immediately who she was. The eyes, the shape of the face, even the way she hummed. Everything was identical to Delilah as a child. But how to approach his granddaughter without scaring her? How to explain that he was her grandfather without revealing that he had lost his own daughter through pride and stubbornness? The old man decided to protect her in silence, always watching from afar, always ensuring that she had at least one ice cream a day, always warding off the bigger dangers without her noticing. But now, seeing Richard caring for Lily with genuine affection, Benny wondered if it wasn't time to reveal the truth. The problem was that he didn't know where Delilah was, if she was still alive, if she would ever return to look for her daughter. And there was something else that worried him. In recent days, he had seen a black car parked near the church, always with a man in sunglasses observing the interactions between Richard and Lily. Benny knew those types of people. Detectives, investigators, people paid to uncover secrets. Danger was approaching, and Benny could feel it in the air like the coming rain. Lily, who was finally starting to trust someone again, was about to find herself at the center of a storm that could destroy the fragile hope that had been reborn in her heart. The report arrived in Margaret's hands on a Friday afternoon, inside a manila envelope that the private detective delivered personally. Her hands trembled as she opened the document that would change everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Subject investigated. Richard Sterling. Location of suspicious activities. First Baptist Church of Harmony Creek, every day at 11 a.m., she read, feeling the blood run cold in her veins. Person of interest. Minor. Approximately 4 years old, female, resident in a homeless situation. The attached photos showed Richard talking to a dirty and ragged girl, offering food, crouching down to be at her level. In one of the images, he was even smiling, something that Margaret hadn't seen at home in months. Relationship established approximately 1 month ago, the report continued. Daily meetings always at the same time. Additional investigations revealed that the subject has been researching medical treatments for childhood hearing impairment. Margaret let the paper fall onto the mahogany table in the living room. 15 years. 15 years trying to give Richard a child, going through every possible treatment, suffering with each negative test, with each frustrated hope. And now she discovered that he had found a child to love, a street girl who wasn't his, who didn't have his blood, who didn't carry his genes. The anger that took over Margaret wasn't ordinary. It was something cold and calculating, a fury that burned inside like acid. How dared he seek outside the home what she couldn't give him? How dared he smile at a stranger while she suffered in silence every month? That same afternoon, Margaret made a decision that would change the fate of everyone involved. She took her car and drove to the center of town, looking for the girl in the photographs. She found Lily sitting on the steps of the church, drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal. The girl looked up when she saw the elegant woman approaching, finding that presence so different from the usual. "Are you Lily?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice soft despite the storm that was forming in her chest. The girl nodded shyly, not understanding why that pretty lady knew her name. "Do you know Mr. Richard? The man who brings you food?" Lily smiled for the first time, her eyes sparkling as she remembered the businessman's kindness. "Nice man," she said with her hoarse little voice. Lily's smile was like a stab in Margaret's heart. That dirty and abandoned child received from her husband something that she, his legitimate wife, had never been able to awaken: genuine joy. "Listen carefully, girl," Margaret said, crouching down to be at Lily's level. "That man isn't as good as you think. He's just playing with you. Soon he'll get tired and leave like all the adults do." Lily frowned, trying to understand the woman's words. Her limited hearing captured only fragments, but the tone of voice was enough to scare her. "If you really want help," Margaret continued, "you need to get out of this town. There are people looking for you, people who can give you a better life far away from here." Margaret wasn't completely lying. During her investigation into Lily, she had discovered that the girl's mother, Delilah, was alive, and she had a plan to use that information. That night, Margaret made a call that located Delilah in a cheap boarding house in Atlanta. The conversation was direct and cruel. "Your daughter is becoming a cause of scandal in Harmony Creek," Margaret said. "There's a rich man taking an interest in her, offering food, taking her to doctors. People are starting to talk." On the other end of the line, Delilah felt a twinge of something that might be maternal conscience, but it was quickly suffocated by greed. In the 2 years that she had abandoned Lily, she had become involved with drugs and violent men, losing jobs and dignity. Now at 28, she was desperate and penniless. "So what? What's that got to do with me?" Delilah replied, trying to sound indifferent. "It has everything to do with it, because that man is a millionaire, and if you go back now to get your daughter, you can get a generous compensation for the embarrassing situation he created." Margaret planted the seed of extortion with the precision of a surgeon. She knew human nature well, especially the greedy side that poverty and despair could awaken. 3 days later, Delilah arrived in Harmony Creek with an old suitcase and a plan in her head. She had lost weight, her hair was dull and unkempt, and purple marks on her arms told stories she preferred to forget. But her eyes still shone with the same cunning that had made her survive on the streets of Atlanta. Meanwhile, Richard had managed to schedule an appointment with a specialist in pediatric audiology. Dr. Miller, the best ENT doctor in the region, had agreed to examine Lily free of charge after Richard explained the situation. "Monday at 2 in the afternoon, Richard said to Lily, crouching next to her on the church steps. "I'm going to take you to a doctor who can help you hear better." Lily didn't fully understand what he was saying, but the kindness in his voice reassured her. She had begun to look forward to those daily encounters as the best part of her lonely days. That's when Delilah appeared. "Lily, my daughter!" she shouted, crossing the square towards the church. The girl looked up and froze. For a moment, she didn't recognize the thin and unkempt woman approaching. But when Delilah got closer, something in Lily's memory stirred. A familiar smell, a way of walking, something that touched the deepest memories of her 4 years. "Mommy?" Lily whispered, her small voice laden with confusion and hope. Richard watched the scene without understanding what was happening. The woman who was hugging Lily didn't look anything like the loving mother he had imagined. There was something desperate in her gestures, something false in her tears. "Excuse me," Richard said, approaching cautiously. "Are you Lily's mother?" Delilah looked up at him, assessing him quickly. The expensive suit, the gold watch, the luxury car parked in front of the church, everything confirmed the information that Margaret had given her. "Yes, I am. And who are you?" she asked, putting on a protective pose that didn't match the 2 years of abandonment. I've been helping Lily, bringing food, making sure she was safe," Richard explained, feeling an inexplicable need to justify himself. "Helping?" Delilah repeated, her voice taking on an accusatory tone. "And why would a rich man like you be interested in a poor girl like my daughter?" The question hit Richard like a punch. There was a poisonous insinuation in Delilah's words, a suggestion of impure motives that made him nauseous. "I just wanted to help," he murmured. "She was alone, hurt. Hurt because I wasn't here to protect her," Delilah said, pulling Lily closer. "But now I'm back. And I'm going to take my daughter away from this town where strange men take advantage of vulnerable children." Richard felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. In a few words, that woman had transformed his months of genuine care into something dirty and suspicious. "That's not how it is," he tried to explain. "I made a doctor's appointment for her to treat her hearing." "Doctor's appointment?" Delilah interrupted, feigning indignation. "Who gave you the right to make decisions about my daughter? Who authorized you to take her to doctors?" Lily watched the discussion between the two adults, not fully understanding the words, but feeling the tension in the air. Her eyes moved from Delilah to Richard, as if trying to understand what was happening to the safe world she had begun to build. "Listen carefully, sir," Delilah said, her voice lowering to a threatening tone. "I don't know what your intentions are with my daughter, but this will have consequences. People will know what happened here." At that moment, Cecil Sterling, 35, appeared in the square. Richard's younger brother had received an anonymous call informing him about a delicate situation involving his brother and a child. Curious and always looking for opportunities to take advantage of his older brother's weaknesses, he decided to investigate personally. "Richard," Cecil said, approaching with an expression of false concern. "What's going on here?" Cecil's presence was the last straw. Delilah immediately realized that she now had a larger audience, an opportunity to create a scandal that could yield much more money. "This man has been taking advantage of my daughter," she said, raising her voice so that other people in the square could hear. "A rich married man, stalking a 4-year-old child." Lily began to cry, frightened by the screams and the confusion that was forming around her. The safe world that Richard had created for her was collapsing before her eyes, and she didn't understand why. The rumors spread through Harmony Creek like wildfire. In a matter of hours, the entire town was talking about the scandal involving Richard Sterling and the Beggar girl. Cecil didn't waste time fueling the gossip, whispering in strategic ears that his brother had lost his mind and was obsessively stalking a child. In the Sterling mansion, Margaret feigned surprise when the neighbors called to comment on what they had heard. Inside, she felt a bitter satisfaction seeing her plan work perfectly. Richard arrived home that night completely destroyed, his face grey and his hands trembling. "Is it true what they're saying?" Margaret asked, playing the role of the shocked wife. "That you've been secretly meeting with a street girl?" "It's not how people are saying it," Richard replied, collapsing into an armchair. "I was just trying to help. She was alone, suffering." 15 years, Richard," Margaret exploded, letting her real fury leak through the acting. 15 years I've been trying to give you a child, and you go out there playing father with a stranger." "That's not what it was," Richard murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. How to explain something that he himself didn't fully understand? how to justify the inexplicable need he felt to protect Lily. Meanwhile, in a cheap boarding house in downtown Harmony Creek, Delilah counted and recounted the bills she had received from Margaret as an advance for her cooperation. $5,000, more money than she had seen together in the last 2 years. And that was just the beginning. Lily was lying on an old, smelly bed, huddled in a corner, watching the mother who had suddenly returned to her life. Delilah was talking loudly on the phone, negotiating with someone about lawsuits and settlements, words that the girl didn't understand, but that sounded threatening. "Yes, he's a millionaire," Delilah was saying. "He has companies, a mansion, an imported car. If we play it right, we can get a pretty generous amount out of this scandal." Lily closed her eyes and tried to remember Richard's gentle face, the way he smiled when he brought her food. She didn't understand why her mother spoke of him with so much anger, why she had transformed her only moments of happiness into something bad. The next day, Benny learned of the scandal through customers buying ice cream. His heart broke as he imagined Lily at the center of that storm. For 2 years he had protected his granddaughter in secret, always vigilant, always taking care of her from a distance. Now he saw his worst fears coming true. That afternoon, Benny made the most difficult decision of his life. He closed the ice cream cart early and headed to the boarding house where Delilah was staying. It was time to confront the past he had tried to forget for 28 years. Delilah answered the door with irritation, expecting it to be some salesman or beggar. When she saw her father's face, her world stopped. Benny was older, more stooped, but he was still the proud man who had kicked her out of the house when he discovered her pregnancy at 17. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with surprise and resentment. "Delilah," Benny said, struggling to maintain his composure. "I've come to get my granddaughter." "Your granddaughter?" Delilah laughed bitterly. "Now she's your granddaughter. Where were you when I needed help? Where were you when I was pregnant and scared, and you threw me out of the house, calling me a tramp?" Benny lowered his head, the weight of guilt crushing his shoulders. "I was wrong, daughter. I was very wrong. But I won't let you use Lily to extort money from that man." "Extort?" Delilah feigned indignation. "I'm protecting my daughter from a pervert who's been stalking children. I've seen everything, Delilah. For 2 whole years I've taken care of Lily without her knowing who I was. I saw when you abandoned her on that rainy morning. I saw her going hungry, cold, scared. And I also saw the genuine kindness of that man when he started taking care of her." Lily appeared at the bedroom door, recognizing the voice of the old ice cream vendor who had always been kind to her. "Ice cream, Grandpa," she said with her hoarse little voice. Benny's heart filled with love and pain at the same time. "Hi, my little granddaughter," he said, crouching down to be at her level. "Grandpa came to get you." "Grandpa?" Lily repeated, confused. Delilah realized she was losing control of the situation. "Get out of here, old man. You have no right over her." "I have more right than you, who abandoned that child to get mixed up with drugs and thugs," Benny retorted, showing a firmness he hadn't displayed in decades. The argument was interrupted by violent knocks on the door. Cecil entered without waiting for permission, accompanied by 2 men Delilah didn't know. "Ms. Delilah?" Cecil said with a fake smile. "I've come to help you with your problem. My brother needs to learn that he can't go around taking advantage of vulnerable families." Benny immediately recognized Cecil's true intentions. It wasn't protection he was offering, but pure opportunism. Richard's brother had seen in the situation a chance to harm the businessman who had always overshadowed him. "I have some lawyers who can help you get fair compensation," Cecil continued. "My brother has a lot of money, and some of it should go to you and your daughter for the trauma caused." Delilah felt her eyes light up with greed. $5,000 from Margaret was just the beginning. With a well-crafted lawsuit, she could get much more. "And what would that compensation be?" she asked. $50,000, Cecil said. "Half now. Half when you leave town and never speak of the matter again." Lily watched all the adults talking about her as if she were an object, something to be negotiated. She didn't understand the complex words, but she felt that something very bad was happening. Instinctively, she moved closer to Benny, the only one there who gave her a sense of security. Meanwhile, Richard was in his office trying to work but unable to concentrate. He had lost 30 pounds in a week, couldn't sleep, and his company was beginning to feel the effects of his distraction. Employees whispered in the hallways, clients asked indirect questions, and his decades-long reputation was being destroyed day by day. Margaret entered the office without knocking, carrying papers in her hand. "A summons arrived," she said, throwing the documents on the desk. "Delilah is suing you for emotional distress and psychological damage to her daughter." Richard read the papers with growing horror. The accusations were detailed and convincing. A rich man stalking a vulnerable child, offering gifts to win her trust, trying to separate her from her mother with promises of medical treatment. "They're asking for $100,000 in damages," Margaret continued, watching the despair on her husband's face. "And they want you to be prohibited from approaching the girl." "But I just wanted to help," Richard repeated, like a desperate mantra. "Help," Margaret said, her mask finally falling completely. "Or were you trying to fill the void that I couldn't fill? Were you playing father with a stranger because your own wife is barren?" The word barren echoed in the office like a gunshot. It was the first time that Margaret had verbalized that fear that had consumed her for years. At that moment, Richard understood that his life had become a web of lies and manipulations, where he was simultaneously victim and culprit. He understood that Lily, the innocent child who had awakened in him feelings dormant for decades, was being used as a pawn in a cruel game where everyone had ulterior motives, except Benny. The old ice cream vendor was the only one there who really cared about Lily's well-being. And when Benny saw Delilah signing the papers that Cecil had brought, agreeing to take her daughter away from Harmony Creek in exchange for money, he knew he had to act. "Delilah," he said, his voice laden with an authority that surprised everyone in the room, "before you sign anything, you need to know the truth about who Lily really is." Everyone turned to him, waiting. Benny looked at his granddaughter, who was watching him with her hazel eyes full of trust, and took a breath to reveal the secret he had kept for 2 years. "Lily isn't just your daughter, Delilah. She's my granddaughter, and there's something about her family, about who she really is, that will change everything you think you know about this situation. If you liked this wonderful story, please comment. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos."